I will make sure my remarks are brief so we don't get too far behind schedule. Welcome.
That was brief.
My name is Marcellus Blount, and I'm one of the co-directors of African American Studies with Carl Hart. We are this year working on a number of things for IRAAS. And one of the things that we've had a pleasure doing is putting together this 20th anniversary symposium. There have been a lot of celebrations around the country of African American studies, and we are excited about celebrating ourselves. And our history of African American studies has led to the present moment in which we're attempting to redefine, in a sense, where we are and where we're headed. We think about ourselves within the context of a statement of identity that returns us to the site of origins and takes us into the future, I hope. And that is, what do we do at IRAAS? And we're trying to envision the Academy as a site for critical engagement for social transformation. This notion governs everything that we do, and critical engagement at its center is necessary for the kind of social transformation that we're talking about. And so the kind of event that we have today, this symposium, we hope will lead to a sense of critical engagement, perhaps even social transformation. We've assembled a team of brilliant scholars. We may take over the university. It may be the case that African American Studies, which has grown in the last 20 years, may grow even larger rather swiftly. IRAAS is an intellectual community that bridges scholarship, teaching, and public life. And so, as scholars, our research is extraordinarily important, but our teaching mission is important as well. So it's nice to see students here, and it's been a pleasure to have worked with students who have been graduated over the years. And I'd just like to point out that Professor Pattilo is a graduate of Columbia, whom I've not seen in some time, and welcome back. Welcome back. It's good to see when our students have taken what they've learned here and transformed it into such exciting scholarly work. What we do, where we are, is at present, we specialize in African American studies in music, religion, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and literature. And all of this is under the rubric of history, and in terms of how we think about how we organize ourselves. It's important for us to have an historical perspective. In other words, to look backward over the last 20 years, and also to think about where it is that we're headed, to meld past, present, and future. Let me say a few words about this symposium. We wanted it to be a small gathering of scholars talking to one another, engaged in conversation. And of course, Conversations is one of the series of events that we host over the course of the year. Conversations that we hope will take place today and that we try to foster in the conferences that we do. Conversations with scholars today of different disciplines and maybe different attitudes toward discipline and the exciting work that they're doing. That I hope leads us to a kind of meta-disciplinary discussion, a self-consciousness about methodologies and structures. And then the speakers, of course, will be talking about their work. This is very exciting work. 20 years of history of African American studies might be thought of in the larger context of looking backward historically, and now I'm thinking of 1963. When we thought about putting the symposium together, we were mindful that this was a year of multiple anniversaries. And as a literary scholar, it's just, I'm going to point out that this is the year that James Baldwin published The Fiery Next Time. And I think that maybe that's kind of a guidebook for what we're doing now in IRAAS, helping to foster social change, certainly, thinking of our mission as education, and producing works we trust that will endure. So we've been looking backward. We're also attending to where we are now and perhaps a future tense for IRAAS and the enterprise that we're engaged in nationally. A number of you, I'm sure a lot of you have either worked with people who are here at Columbia in IRAAS, or, and I'm sure you've read their scholarship. I just actually would like to remind you of who we are and hope that we meet again. The core faculty for African American Studies includes Kevin Feliz, Stephen Gregory, Farrah Griffin, Sam Roberts, Carla Shedd, Yosef Surratt, and Sudhir Venkatesh. And the core faculty really are at the center of the Institute. But we are fortunate to have research fellows, and I'm fortunate to have one of them. But as well, the research fellows are Carl Hart, Fred Harris, Kelly Jones, Valerie Purdy Vaughn, Dorian Warren, and Mabel Wilson. We have expanded in the last 20 years, and we hope that we'll continue to do so. When we have a symposium like this one, we get the kinds of ideas that we need to move forward. And of course, when we have these ideas and these discussions of ideas, we think about institutional structures, and also we think about the ways in which the administration might facilitate our future growth. Was that heard? Okay. The symposium schedule, the most important part of today's schedule. So I'm going to shut up soon so we don't get too behind in our schedule. The first panel is called Foundations, and it includes Joshua Guild, Mary Pattilo, Jonathan Rieder, and with Sam Roberts as moderator. We'll take a lunch break from 12 to 2 and return for a panel from 2 to 4, which we've conceptualized as imagined futures. And our speakers include, we'll have work from Jafari Allen, Kies Limon, Alondra Nelson, Imani Perry, and that session will be moderated by Professor Farrah Griffin. Later today at 4, we have a keynote lecture, and Elizabeth Alexander will deliver that lecture, and I just can't wait to hear what she has to say. And then our own Professor Carla Shedd is going to offer closing remarks as we try to tie up the discussion that we've had today. But first and foremost, we have the opportunity to listen to scholars' new work, to have a conversation about that work, and to think about the ways that their work makes possible the kind of scholarship that we should be producing throughout the African American Studies programs in the country and as well at ours. So just please, if you don't mind, if you could join me in a welcome to our panelists. I'd like to introduce Sam Roberts, who is moderating the first session. And Sam needs no introduction as an important historian here and a core faculty member. And it's the case next year that Sam will be the director of IRAAS. And so we look forward to all the kinds of things that he will do.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, good to see everyone. I want to thank the organizing committee, Marcellus, Carla Shedd, and Farrah Griffin, for this wonderful event and for the wonderful scholars that have been brought together. And also, thank you for having it at such a civilized hour. So this is a good time to start, right? I feel really rested. I've had a couple cups of coffee. I've been to a lot of conferences recently where they start us at 8 in the morning, and that's not the way to do things, folks. It's not, we could do better than that. All right, it's my pleasure to moderate the panel this morning on foundations. We have 3 prominent scholars who are eminently qualified to discuss with us the foundations of Black studies and how we should all think about ourselves in that context. We're going to have them present in this order. Starting with my far right is Professor Jonathan Rieder. Rieder.
Everybody mispronounced.
I'm sorry, I do apologize. I'm messing up already here, sorry. Jonathan Rieder is Professor of Sociology at Barnard College and a member of the graduate faculty at Columbia University. He's previously taught at Yale and Swarthmore. He is the author of The Word of the Lord is Upon Me, The Righteous Performance of Martin Luther King Jr., and also Canarsie, The Jews and Italians of Brooklyn Against Liberalism. He edited The Fractious Nation, Unity and Division in Contemporary American Life, and he was co-founding editor of Common Quest, the magazine of Black Jewish relations. Rieder has been a regular commentator on TV and radio, a contributor to the New York Times Book Review, and a contributing editor to the New Republic. He's been a member and a visitor at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton and been awarded fellowships by the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, the Wilson Center, the National Humanities Center, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. He's currently working on a book about the rise of contemporary crossover culture and the transformation of rhythm and blues into soul music. Following Professor Rieder will be Joshua Gild, who is an assistant professor who specializes in 20th century African American history with a particular focus on urban communities and the making of the modern African diaspora. Professor Gild is a native of Boston and received a PhD from Yale University in African American Studies and History and a BA from Wesleyan University, where he graduated with honors. He has received several fellowships and awards, including a Fox International Fellowship that enabled him to study at Cambridge University in 2003, and a Chavez Eastman Marshall Dissertation Fellowship at Dartmouth College from 2005 to 2006. He also received fellowships from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. Most recently, he has been the recipient of a Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship for junior faculty and a residential fellowship from the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. Professor Gild is currently completing his first book, tentatively entitled Shadows of the Metropolis, Urban Space, and the Transformation of Black Communities in Post-War New York and London. This is a comparative examination of Black communities in central Brooklyn, where there were large numbers of Caribbean immigrants interacting with African Americans, and also the Notting Hill area of West London, where there was an influx of Caribbean immigrants interacting with native Britons. The book focuses on the evolution of these communities against the backdrop of civil rights and Black Power movements, issues of police brutality and racial violence, and the role of Caribbean Carnival in both cities. And if you've ever seen Josh do talks, either at conferences or at public events, you're like me, you're probably anticipating the publication of this book. We said later this year, no, next year? All right, fantastic. Finally is Mary Pattilo, who, even to those of us who do not work in sociology, is a very well-known name for her groundbreaking work in African American sociology and urban sociology. She's the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University, received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 1997. Her areas of interest include race and ethnicity, with an emphasis on class stratification, urban sociology, and qualitative methods. She was a predoctoral Javits and Truman Scholar and has won awards, grants, and fellowships from the Ford Foundation, Fulbright Hayes, the George A. and Eliza Gardner Howard Foundation, and from the MacArthur Foundation. Her first book, Black Picket Fences, Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class, from University of Chicago Press, 1999, won the Oliver Cromwell Cox Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association. She's published articles in American Sociological Review, Social Forces, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Journal of Affordable Housing Research, and other journals. She's co-editor of Imprisoning America, The Social Effects of Mass Incarceration, on Russell Sage Press in 2004. Her book, Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City, University of Chicago Press, 2007, examines conflict and consensus as one African American neighborhood deals with gentrification and the transformation of public housing. And it received the Park Best Book Award from the ASA. Current projects include a four-city study of the effects of housing on children's development funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and many others. And she's also a founding board member of the Urban Prep Charter Academies Incorporated, a network of all boys high schools in Chicago. That said, please, well, before we do our official welcome, I'd like to say that each of our speakers will speak. I've been told to keep a tight line on time limit, so it'll be 20 minutes, and I'll give you little flags here and there, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience for questions. All right, for now, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
So I don't want to give Sam a hard time because he didn't really mess up on my name. It's my spelling of the name. I've always spelled. I'm the one who messed up. And I'll just add one additional thing. My most recent book came out in April on the actual 50th anniversary of the letter from Birmingham jail, which is Gospel of Freedom, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and the struggle to change the nation. And I'm going to talk a bit about how I got there and how the inspiration I took from a lot of the forces that have been shaping African American studies. So God is raging in the words of the prophet. And that's what Martin Luther King's pal, Rabbi Heschel, wrote at one time. And when we think of King with his great sense of dignity, but especially in this season of 50-year anniversaries of various kinds, there's just too much idolatry of St. Martin, the dreamer, to think of King raging. Surely on the surface it did seem like King was raging in the dream, and his overture, his opening words in the letter from Birmingham jail, my dear fellow clergymen, it's downright affable, precious almost in its gentility. So today I want to dwell not on the dreamer, but on the bristling leader who figures so prominently in my Gospel of Freedom. It's the king who chastises the oppressor race. The king, the Christian warrior who is hardly naive about the power of moral appeal to change very many white people's sense of conscience. And yes, even that fearsome, even mythological figure, an angry black man. So in keeping with the official mandate of informality, I'm not going to really get too much into the argument of Gospel of Freedom. Instead, I'm going to indulge in some storytelling, but there's a point to the stories I tell, which is about method. The gumshoe work that gave me access to this less than dreamy king. Now, this pursuit of the inaccessible, the look for the earthy, gritty reality behind King made sense to me as an ethnographer. Decades ago, too many decades I must say, when I was writing about white backlash in Brooklyn, I once found myself on a Brooklyn playground with some young Italian-American toughs, and they've been involved in a long cycle of attack and reprisal with black students in the school. And these Italian-Americans had broken into the shop, and they'd stolen screwdrivers, and they were on the handball court banging and yelling like crazy. And by then I'd earned their trust to hang out with them, and certainly Mary and Carla know more than a little bit about what's involved to get that stage. And I hear them say the following: we're rising up, we're not taking it anymore. We're gonna kill the motherfucking niggers. Moments later, two black guys walk by and go, "Yo, Vinny, when you white boys be breaking, we're staying out of it. Catch you later." And it was moments like that that reminds me again of something simple that I could put in fancy sociolinguistic terms, which is utterances often make sense only in the context of the vernacular settings in which they're being performed, and it's very easy to impose foreign meanings from outside the world on things, especially that are unsettling or distasteful to us. Al Sharpton once told me in the midst of some brouhaha in Manhattan back, I think in the 90s, he said, I never said, he said, I said crackers. I never said honkies. That's all white people. So again, these kind of distinctions that require you to dig deep into, again, the meaning of the performance and the setting and the intentions of the speakers, kind of that was part of the spirit in which I came to pursue King over 20 years in 2 books now. And that detective work seems very much in the spirit of today's gathering, and the range of work by all sorts of people, I was going to say in this panel, in this room for that matter, in the spirit of today's celebration of African American studies, for whatever rival forces have entered the birth and biography and even varieties of African American studies programs, political, ethnic, theoretical, one of the consequences of the extraordinary body of work that has come out of now what's more than a generation of creative burst has been supremely conservative, downright empirical. That is, driven by the desire to tell a fuller truth, to expand knowledge of actual reality. I know that's epistemologically a complicated concept for some, and to illuminate the talk and meaning in all the metaphoric hush arbors of black life. But how to carry out an ethnography of a dead person, in my case, and especially of a dead saint. How to follow the ethnographer's zeal to get to the backstage, as it were. I couldn't talk to King, but I could spend a lot of time with his colleagues. And not just his closest colleagues, but with the foot soldiers, people like Willie Bolden and C.T. Johnson and J.T. Johnson, who were the people who actually were part of the social production of a King performance in Albany, Georgia, in Selma, the unheralded, often, field workers who created the social conditions for the production of a King event, and even King's white driver, about whom Daddy King never stopped saying, you know, Martin's got a white boy for a driver, Martin's got a white boy for a driver, who also brought a kind of interesting, intimate access to King from hours driving with him when King would kick back and say things that ordinarily he wouldn't say in public. And since King's brilliance lay more in speaking than in writing, his written stuff is often pompous and convoluted. He was too busy to do much writing. And he had a team of ghostwriters. And it's not that he wasn't engaged in it, but it's not where his artistry lay and his passion lay. And so for more than a decade, I set about trying to track down all the recordings I could of King before black audiences, in the mass meetings, in his workaday sermons, not just at Ebenezer, but in all kinds of black churches. And so all this would flow into my previous book, The Word of the Lord is Upon Me. And it's not that the high-minded universalist or that Morehouse man with his impeccable manners ever disappeared exactly, but it took its place within a larger repertoire of idioms and identities, of which the lofty universalism was only one part. So for today, it's enough simply to say the occasion mattered mightily. So let me just give you a flavor for some of those occasions and the kings that emerged there. Cutting up with his rowdy preacher buddies, this more down-home king was a master of the dozens, threw around the term cracker, and joked about fried chicken eating preachers and raunchier things still. One of his fortes was preaching the funerals of his colleagues, because he knew at a very young age that he was going to die before he was 40. And as he said, Wyatt T. Walker, was there, still remembers. Even last year, his face goes somber when he remembers King in January. They're getting ready to prepare. They're going all in on Birmingham, and King looks around and says, some of us in this room are not coming back from Birmingham. And what Andrew Young said about that occasion, he said, Dr. King was teaching us to accept the possibility of our own death. But King would immediately shift out of that and start saying, now y'all, and I'm channeling Young's account of King's telling of this, you all think they're going to get me, but you'll all be jumping out in front of the camera, and the Klan is going to get you. But I will preach you the best funeral you ever had. And then he would find some foible to make fun of in each of his colleagues. Andy Young, the Klan should never have heard a hair on the head of Andy Young. Of all my colleagues, nobody loved white people more than Andy. Before black congregations, the preacher King often presented himself not just as a lover of all God's children, but as a tender consoler of the race. He would reprise the role of that old black preacher who told, and I'm quoting King now, his people, he would say to them all week long, you've been told you're nothing all week long, you've been called a nigger, but I want to say to you, and here King's thickening of dialect creates the impression that he has become the slave preacher. I come here to tell you, you ain't no nigger, you ain't no slave, you are somebody. Again, powerful moments of black communion existing even in the midst of a praising of God's universal message. Unless we become too distracted by King's occasional use of the American dream motif and the use of civil religious language, it's good to remember that King's relationship to civil religion was highly ambivalent. And when you hear him, for him, much more important than the American dream was the dream of the slaves. That's what he roots all the other dreams in. He saw America less as a redeemer nation than a nation in need of redemption. And so you've got to keep in mind when you're hearing I Have a Dream, this kind of comment in a mass meeting in the Black Belt, but they didn't give us any land and they haven't given us anything. After making our foreparents work and labor for 244 years for nothing, didn't pay them a cent. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. That's a beautiful creed. And then King says sarcastically, America's never lived up to it. The men who wrote that owned slaves. So it'd be easy to stop here and think about a simple kind of model. Black audiences, black talk, white audiences, white talk. But in fact, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, things were never that simple for King. The boundaries between these two were never impermeable. For one thing, there was never one black backstage. As John Lewis told me, he said, look, I knew King since I was a boy, but King never got into that rowdy talk with me. I wasn't part of the rambunctious crowd, the day-to-day crew. Second, King was the ultimate mix master before both white and black audiences. That's why focusing on King's sources doesn't get you, it gets you somewhere, but not all the way, because King was always mixing both kinds of sources and all other kinds of sources before all his audiences. He quoted Keats and Kant in little shotgun churches in the hinterland of Selma. He testified to his love of spirituals and shouted out to the black slave ancestors from liberal Protestant white pulpits. Third, and this is really what I want to kind of move on, because I think this is, again, coming back to that empirical force of so much of great African American studies work. Although King modulated his tone and emphasis before white audiences, he never eliminated the defiant stance, the interludes of black pride, or the traces of rebuke. And I'd say that's true even in the second half of I Have a Dream, which is his dreamier part, which he had not planned, but that's for another day. So all this detective work flowed into The Word of the Lord is Upon Me, and it guided me as I turned to the Gospel of Freedom in the letter. I could spot in the letter those riffs and runs, because King was a collage producer. He composed by taking bits, sampling himself and everybody else in new permutations. And I knew where each little riff and run had appeared and some of the other meanings that carried along. I returned to talk to Wyatt Walker and C.T. Vivian and Joseph Lowry, and Young and Walker were there when King was writing at that moment, and they knew the anger that was driving that. And most critically, I was the beneficiary of a black soundtrack to go along with the letter. I discovered extraordinary, unknown preached version of the letter that King delivered at 16th Street Baptist Church just after he got out of jail, in which he cites some of what will go into the letter, but there are also key differences. And those recordings guided me before. You hear King lambasting black ministers in the language of racial solidarity. A minister who can't stand up with his own people isn't fit to be a leader. He disparages violators of the boycott of the downtown stores as traitors to their race, which is unusual for King. Abernathy would call out Uncle Tom's in the mass meetings affectionately, but King always bucked up blacks who were suffering from internalized racism and say, you, whether it's, on God's keyboard, a bass black or a treble white, you're all as, worth something in God's mind. So we know how rattled he is even before he starts writing letters. But the most extraordinary moment may be in that preach version, just maybe a day and a half, 2 days out of the jail. King starts, not on Birmingham, but he harkens back to a day when he attended the installation of Kwame Nkrumah as the first president of Ghana. And that was an incredible moment for King. Being in Africa, he was undone. And when he walked the streets of Accra, he heard, and I could hear that old spiritual saying, free at last, free at last. That's what he remembered when he walked around Accra. And he describes Nkrumah, a handsome black man, mounted the platform and told his people, we are now a free and independent nation. Only when he put Birmingham blacks into this larger story of black possibility did he come back to Birmingham. And what he does then, and he says, he tells the jail story, because he'd been in depression and despondent, and he plummeted down, and then he got the letter criticizing by these 8 white ministers. And that anger kind of sent him propelling back up the mountain again on a tide of indignation. And what does King say to a black audience when he tells his story? You go to prison, and sometimes you meet a friend, and they got to bring you some dinner, and they got to bring you some lunch, and they say, Reverend, I know what you represent, and tomorrow I'll sneak you the paper. And so King then describes reading that statement by the white ministers, and you hear his anger rising as he tells the audience, why didn't you wait? Lines right from the letter. His King's molasses slow preacher voice, saturated with cold fury. Well, all I have to say, we've been waiting long enough. The Negroes never heard anything but the word wait. Wait for a more convenient season. And it's not the dreamer who offers this understanding that blacks are alone in an overwhelmingly indifferent white America. And what he says, freedom is not something given by the oppressor. It is demanded by the oppressed. That's in the letter. But then he adds this, and there's a kind of tremulousness in his voice as he said, don't you ever think that anything is going to be given to us in this struggle. The only gains we've made are things we've done ourselves through our own direct action. And so I was alerted then, very early on in thinking about the letter, that rather than seeing it as a philosophical reflection on civil disobedience, despite all the allusions to Tillich and Buber, it begins as a cry of black pain and black anger. If we situate King in the moment of creation and all the other things we know that he's feeling at the time. So I'm going to move towards the close if I'm not yet in trouble, about to be gone. I have 4 or 5 minutes. Uh-oh, Sam's got 2, 3. All right, I'll pick up the pace here. So as I describe it in Gospel of Freedom, King shifts in the middle of the letter. He's done trying to explain and justify to whites, and he basically accepts the fact that maybe there's no possibility of moral persuasion. The way I describe it is the labor of legitimacy yields to the passion of prophecy, and the rest of the letter is primarily a glorious smackdown of not the Klan, but white moderates, the core of American culture. Most of us who've read the letter know that aspect in black religion. The whiteness of whites, he basically says, makes them virtually incapable of empathy. Few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race. And it reminds us in the one meeting that King had with Elijah Muhammad, when King says to the messenger, "Do you really believe that all whites are devils? You know, I know that a lot of whites have a lot of devil in them." And then the messenger says, "Well, we're both from Georgia. There was the king snake that was nice, and there was the rattlesnake that was mean, but they both snakes." And King wasn't above sharing a laugh about that. They were arguing about the degree of white devilry and perhaps its ordained quality or not. So in the end, and I'll end on this note, I guess 2 other points, if Sam will permit. Notice that at the end, King says, even if the white church does not come to our aid, and he's talking about white society more, I have no fear. He doesn't find solace in the theology of hope, and I think that's because he has such contempt for these ministers. He's not going to share a spiritual moment. He's not going to tell them the Lord will make a way out of no way and the resurrection follows the crucifixion. And he doesn't go anywhere near the American dream except for one kind of pro forma sentence. Instead, he finds faith in his memory of the slave ancestors, and if the inexcusable cruelties of slavery could not stop us, these problems in Birmingham will not stop us. And I'll close on this note. At one point at the end, King says, perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the inner ecclesia. Pretty fancy schmancy language. And King Abernathy often used to tease King, often in mass meetings. He told you about agape and how it's different from eros. And he said it might be the way your lover walks and it might be the way your lover talks. I'm glad he didn't tell you what that eros really is. So there was that teasing about the raw and the refined, the fancy and the down home. But King says, I must turn my faith to the true ecclesia. Now, telling someone they lack the true ecclesia is not exactly casting aspersions on their mother. It doesn't rise to the intensity of Jeremiah Wright's judgment. God damn America, that's in the Bible, for treating our citizens as less than human. It never achieves the drama of King's warning a few years later, America is going to hell. And it doesn't even have the pretentious feel of King's very first speech as a civil rights leader in Montgomery. Be still and know that I'm God, and if you don't obey me, I will break the backbone of your power. Standing before love is always justice. And so here is a point I got to that is central to all my understanding of King, that without the work of people like Al Rabbitoe and James Cone and dozens of other people who came out of that African-American studies tradition and was able to recover whole new ways of thinking about social reality and black and white reality in particular. And I would sum up that insight as this when we think of King as an unbound prophet. Because sometimes he doesn't, when the prophet appears, he doesn't look like or sound like a prophet. But the differences are mainly ones of tone, genre, and style. The substance King is saying is precisely the same. In the main, whites were complicit in racism. Their appalling silence was a sin. The religious clergy were guilty of spiritual malpractice. Here was a refined man's version of Jeremiah, a Christian version of telling the man.
Good morning. To thank the committee, Marcellus, Carl, Farrah, Sam, especially Carla, for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here. I want to begin with two epigraphs, and I hope my esteemed literary colleagues will give me permission to dip into the literary to start us off. The first is Zora Neale Hurston from Dust Tracks on the Road, her essay, My People, written in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1937. My people, this very minute, nations of people are moaning it and shaking their heads with a sigh. Thousands and millions of people are uttering it in different parts of the globe. Differences of geography and language make differences in sound, that's all. The sentiment is the same, yet and still it is a private wail, sacred to my people. She goes on, who are my people? I would say all those hosts spoken of as Negroes, colored folks, Aunt Hagar's children, the brother in black, race men and women, and my people. They range in color from Walter White, white through high yeller, pumpkin color, high brown, Vaseline brown, seal brown, black, smooth black, dusty black, rusty black, coal black, lamb black, and damn black. My people there in the south of the world, the east of the world, in the west, and even some few in the north. Still in all, you can't just point out my people by skin color. Zora Neale Hurston. And then Derek Walcott from his epic poem from 1980, The Schooner Flight. Christ have mercy on all sleeping things, from that dog rotting down Wrightson Road to when I was a dog on those streets. If loving these islands must be my load, out of corruption my soul takes wings. But they had started to poison my soul with their big house, big car, big time bobo, coolie, nigger, Syrian, and French Creole. So leave it for them and their carnival. I taking a sea bath, I gone down the road. I know these islands from Monos to Nassau, a rusty-head sailor with sea-green eyes that they nickname Shabeen, the patois for any red nigger. And I, Shabeen, saw when these slums of empire was paradise. I'm just a red nigger who loved the sea. I had a sound colonial education. I have Dutch, nigger, and English in me. And either I'm nobody or I'm a nation. I only met him briefly on a couple of occasions. Manning Marable was a tremendous inspiration. When I was an undergraduate, I read with great interest the debates about the place of black intellectuals, black public intellectuals, so-called, in venues like the Village Voice, and I attended some of the symposia and conferences at places like the Schomburg. And as he advanced his vision of the engaged black radical academic in those contexts, Professor Marable appeared to me as a refreshing alternative to many of the other prominent figures with whom he was often grouped and with whom he often shared stages. Later, a few years after college, when I was living in Brooklyn, trying not to get sucked into the nonprofit industrial complex and applying to graduate school, I vividly remember coming home from my not-so-inspiring 9-to-5 to a message on my answering machine. You remember those answering machines? A message from Professor Marable letting me know that I had been accepted to Columbia and inviting me to come work with him here in Morningside Heights. And I saved that message for as long as I had that machine, and probably somewhere at home I still have the little mini cassette, though I have nothing to play it on. But it meant a tremendous amount to me. I ultimately decided to pursue my PhD instead at Yale, but I remained ever interested in the goings-on here at IRAAS as they came into fruition. I was a charter subscriber. I don't know if there was such a thing, but I'll claim it for myself, a charter subscriber of Souls. And I devoured each new issue during my early years of grad school. I often came down to New York from New Haven for some of the major conferences which Professor Marable was responsible or in which he played a major role. I particularly remember the gathering, the major conference on black feminism, and as well gatherings of the Black Radical Congress. And I've often wondered what my intellectual path would have been like had I chosen to come to Columbia. Because there's no question that while we each bring to graduate school and to our learning more generally our own interests and our more or less faint ideas about what we want to study, we are inevitably shaped by our environment. And the questions we ultimately pursue reflect that context, and that's certainly true for myself. I started the joint PhD program at Yale in History and African American Studies with some sort of vague notions, some interest in intellectual history, and about the college educational experiences of what we could think of as the talented 10th, Du Bois' talented 10th. I was interested in the experience of, say, Paul Robeson at Rutgers University or Adam Clayton Powell at Colgate, a project far, far from where I eventually ended up. I very quickly lost interest in that project for a number of reasons, but in part because it seemed to me too narrow. The very first class I took at Yale was a class called Racial Formations, taught by Hazel Carby. It not only introduced me to new ways of theorizing race, it introduced me to cultural studies. I read C.L.R. James for the first time, and I was forced to think seriously about the Black European experience for the first time. Now, I had also brought with me to graduate school other interests in urban history generally and in African American migration more specifically. But taking that class with Professor Carby, doing a directed reading with Paul Gilroy, rereading actually, so re-encountering Robert Farris Thompson's work, but also attending talks by all the many wonderful people who came through, including the late, great Richard Eiton, opened up new avenues, new ways of thinking about the field and what was possible and what might sustain me as an intellectual endeavor for some years. This was also a moment when US historians, American historians, were beginning kind of explicitly to think about the global context, the so-called transnational turn in history, in US history. And so around this time, 1999, 2000, there were several sort of special issues of major journals, the American Historical Review, Journal of American History, and others publishing issues on this topic of what American history might look like if we thought more globally. And published in this context was a really influential essay that I think in some ways pushed me finally in the direction where I ended up, and that's a piece by Robin Kelley, the amazing historian Robin Kelley, published in the Journal of American History, called But a Local Phase of a World Problem, Black History's Global Vision, 1883 to 1950. And what Robin does in that piece, as only he can, so meticulously, is to show that African American studies, before it was even institutionalized and formalized, had always had this global outlook. So whereas US historians, it was the late 20th century, were really starting to think in explicit terms about their relationship to the world, disciplinarily speaking, African American studies has at its core, the study of Black history has at its core always this engagement with a wider world. This is something that I think I understood somewhat as an undergraduate, but this particular piece led me kind of head on in that direction to my current work. So in my larger book project forthcoming, one hopes next year, I try to trace a history of what I think of as entanglements, a history of Black migration and settlement to London, but also to New York City. It's focused principally on the neighborhoods of central Brooklyn and West London, beginning in the interwar period and heading through the 1970s. The now working title is In the Shadows of the Metropolis, Cultural Politics and Black Communities in Post-War New York and London. And it tries to situate African American migration and urban community formation within the context of diaspora. It does so in a couple of ways. First, by placing the movement of US Black Southerners to the urban North alongside the overlapping migrations of Afro-Caribbean people to both the United States and to Britain. So essentially I have three streams of migration that I'm trying to track in this project. Afro-Caribbeans or West Indians coming both to the United States, but also going to the UK, and as well, Black Southern migration from south to north. So it's trying to link the Great Migration to broader histories of Black population movement, both within and outside the hemisphere. And in emphasizing the mobilization of culture, the book reveals the ways in which people in relatively different urban settings responding to similar, or in some cases quite the same challenges, created community in surprisingly distinct and different ways. The project is, I think of it as a work of social and cultural history whose interpretive framework is at once comparative and transnational, and tries to bring African American, Caribbean, and Black British histories into some kind of mutual conversation. The book locates these two specific urban communities in a global nexus of civil rights, Black power, and decolonization movements. So here are struggles that unfold separately, but that take inspiration from each other. and seem to run in parallel at various points, sharing and remaking language, symbols, and tactics. By attending to these stories of community formation comparatively, which is to say across national borders, but also in relation to one another, the book brings Blackness itself into the fore as an object of inquiry, highlighting its fundamental historical and geographical contingencies. In examining two contrasting political cultures, systems of racial logic, and regimes of public order, the book also considers the tensions between distinctly local dimensions of Black citizenship and transnational Black political subjectivities. Now, whereas liberal political theory often holds that rights are enshrined in and guaranteed by a national state, and whereas diaspora is commonly understood as running counter to conventional modes of citizenship, my work tries to challenge, in some ways, both analytical frameworks by underscoring what I call a kind of urban citizenship, which is at once highly localized, but in key moments is also transnational in its scope, particularly for these Caribbean migrants. Particularly important in the book are contestations over public space. And I argue that these are major features of these processes of Black community formation. So the problem of racial violence is central. Actually, more precisely, anti-Black violence is a central theme that runs through the book, and two of the book's middle chapters take up the theme directly. But also in my study of West Indian Carnival, again, both in Brooklyn and in London, this question of public space and who sort of owns the city, who has the right to the city, to use David Harvey's phrase. There's sort of what I think of as four maybe guiding approaches or interventions that I'm trying to, that I hope my work is making. The first is to really try to think of diaspora as a process, to not think of diaspora as a place, right? We have Africa over here, and maybe the United States over here, and then somewhere else, everywhere else where Black people are is diaspora. I mean, we can do that, and I think, I often fall back on that, but I'm much more interested in thinking about diaspora as a process, as something that's continuous and ongoing. Secondly, I'm trying to, as I started to think about this work, so the very early stages of a dissertation idea was simply to write about the Second Great Migration. So to think about the migration of Black Southerners from World War II through the 1960s into the 70s, kind of more numerous, but somewhat, for some reason, more understudied aspect of the Great Migration. And so that was just initially just going to be an African-American story, just a story of Black Southerners on the move. But I knew I wanted to write about New York. I didn't think I wanted to do Harlem. I wanted to sort of branch out beyond that, and particularly I was interested in Brooklyn. And I realized almost immediately that could not be an African-American only story, that there were Caribbean people everywhere in that narrative, and that just opened up this wider set of concerns and set of questions. But as I started to become more familiar with some of the scholarship in history, but more particularly in the social sciences and sociology and anthropology about Caribbean immigration, Caribbean or West Indian and African American relationships, I became really dissatisfied by this, what I saw as an over-reliance on questions of conflict. The conflict between those two groups, but also questions about assimilation and political incorporation. Not to say that those questions are not important or not useful, but that's not a direction that I wanted to go. I became more interested in and committed to trying to think about the relationship between African Americans and Caribbean Americans in more complex ways, and still yet, Black, British, and later Africans in more complex ways, which is not to essentialize or to collapse or elide these really important differences, because there are real differences, but it's to try to think about the commonalities and the points of solidarity. The third place where I try to go is to try to keep the local and the national and the transnational in view at once. And I can say that it's really hard. It's really hard to do. But I think it's important. I think it's really important to try to do that. And that's not to say that it happens in all parts of the project or in every chapter or every scene, but it's just to sort of say on the whole, I want to keep those three perspectives in view, because I think, again, it gives us a kind of richer texture and more substantive understanding of what Blackness means in a day-to-day context. And then finally, I'm trying to use, so one of the ways I try to do these things, actualize these things, is to use biography and life stories to narrate these broader developments. So I really try to focus on individuals and families to try to tell these stories of these interconnecting communities or overlapping diasporas, to use Earl Lewis's phrase. So I want to just talk, just give a couple snapshots of some of the people that I think that I write about in the book, and then I want to end with two challenges, sort of in the spirit of Val Smith from last night, two challenges that I see coming out of doing this kind of work and for African American studies as a whole. So very quickly, I'm just going to focus on Brooklyn. I'm happy to talk about London in the Q&A. One of the figures that I write about is June Jordan. The amazing writer, poet, and activist. She was the daughter of working-class Jamaican immigrants who was born in Harlem in 1936. And just a year or so after her birth, her family moved into the newly opened Harlem River houses, which is one of the first public housing developments in Harlem. And Jordan describes in various memoirs the Harlem River houses as this kind of a wonderful, safe, clean community of African American and West Indian families living in these modern apartments, really sort of distinct from the kind of slums slum tenements of the Depression. And so she found it sort of difficult to understand why her family would actually move to central Brooklyn in 1940. And in particular, how her working class father, who was a postal worker, was able to buy a brownstone home. But it's only with the benefit of hindsight, looking back, that she could appreciate first what the opportunity to actually buy a house would have meant for her family, a 3-story Bedford-Stuyvesant brownstone, but also the likelihood that her father participated in some type of susu or partner circle, a rotating credit arrangement, very common amongst West Indian immigrants, that was able to facilitate the purchase of this house. Her family moves into this brownstone in Bed-Stuy on Hancock Street. And she talks about a little bit of the neighborhood. I just want to read from her description of her house in the neighborhood, if I can find it, because I think it's really instructive. She describes her block in these terms of a kind of very diverse and vibrant era. She said she had regular exposure to Black American culture since her aunt, who lived in the building with her family, was married to an African American veteran, and the couple lived upstairs. On the block, Jordan recalled, quote, "We had rice and peas and curried lamb, or upstairs in my aunt and uncle's apartment, pig's feet and greens. On the piano in the parlor, there was boogie woogie, blues, and Chopin. Across the street, there were cold water flats. There were American Negroes and West Indians. Some rented their housing, and some were buying their homes. There were Baptists, Holy Rollers, and Episcopalians side by side." And to me, that is the essence of what I'm trying to capture in this story, this notion that someone who recently arrived from South Carolina could move next to someone recently arrived from Trinidad, and just try to understand what that means. What identities are salient at what points? Is it a Black identity? Is it an African American identity? Is it an island identity? Is it something else altogether? Similarly, the future composer and jazz pianist Randy Weston talks about those same kinds of convergences, not only in his neighborhood, but within his own family. His father, Frank Weston, was descended from Jamaican Maroons, but had been born and raised in the Panama Canal Zone. Frank Weston arrived in New York City by way of Cuba in 1924, the same year that the U.S. Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act establishing a new immigration quota system that significantly cut back on West Indian immigration. Frank Weston settles in Bed-Stuy, where he meets and eventually marries Vivian Moore, who's an African-American migrant recently arrived from Virginia. And in their marriage, they produced one son, Randy. Randy Weston, like Shirley Chisholm, another person who I write about, remembers his household as being sort of steeped in Black culture. Both Randy Weston's father, Frank Weston, and Shirley Chisholm's father were followers of Marcus Garvey. So there's this thread that runs throughout this project too, of the kind of specter of Garveyism even into the post-war period. He talks about reading scholars like J.A. Rogers and William Leo Hansberry, these pioneering black historians. And his own musical influences were wide-ranging. He heard popular music from Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Billie Holiday, but also gospel and Cuban music, calypso. Quote, "I was blessed with a combination of the black church, the blues, and the calypso from our Caribbean side, plus hanging out at the Palladium and hearing music from our Afro-Caribbean side." So for him, there was no contradiction, right? You don't hear that kind of refrain of conflict. And there's ways in which we can critically sort of interrogate these recollections to sort of brush off the patina of nostalgia, but I think there's actually something really important here that I'm trying to resuscitate. Weston goes on to say, I was the first generation of New Yorkers. I had the opportunity to savor and enjoy my mother's cooking and my father's cooking, different types of music. There were differences of accent, but I kept seeing the relationship between the two. And they were truly African people, just from different parts of the planet. And so that's the framing for me that I'm interested in, or at least my entry point. It's not necessarily where I end up, but it's certainly the entry point. I said that I wanted to end with what I see as two challenges to the field of African American studies on these questions of diaspora. One is institutional, and the other is, to my mind, pedagogical. On the institutional question, it's the relationship between African American studies and African studies, which I hope we have a chance to discuss at various points, because it looks different at different institutions. At some institutions, those two units or programs are deeply connected, and at other places, Princeton, for example, where I teach, they have almost no relationship to one another. But if we're going to really think about diaspora in some kind of serious way, if we're going to be true to African American studies and black history's roots, kind of global perspective, I think we need to think about and try to work through that relationship kind of more broadly. The second challenge is what I see, and I think many of us see, in part stemming out of what we see in our classrooms. The way I want to phrase it is a need to disaggregate, or to at least critically interrogate, the category of African American, which I think too often we just sort of use as a kind of blanket term for everybody. But what we see in our classrooms, at least at institutions like Columbia and Princeton, are ever more first and second generation African and Caribbean immigrants who have a different relationship to the history of African American struggle, of African American culture. We just have increasingly diverse student bodies. And I think we need to be having these conversations within black studies, if we can use a blanket term, within African American studies as institutionalized, about what we mean when we use that term African American, who's included, who's not, and what are the implications for all of that. So those are two challenges that I see in the field as we move forward. Thank you.
Good. We're moving to afternoon soon, but I think it is still good morning. Thanks to the organizers. We're all giving special shots out to Carla, who was a PhD student of mine at Northwestern. It's a pleasure to be back at Columbia. I'm here in New York for the year, living very nearby. Have a view of the dorm where I lived when I was an undergrad, so this is really a walk down memory lane. But the walk down memory lane doesn't include IRAAS, because IRAAS wasn't here when I was an undergrad. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my time at Columbia, kind of the precursors to IRAAS and some of the activism that was going on while I was here. Then I'll talk a little bit about my own research, and then I'll end not quite talking about the future of African American studies, but to talk about some data that I've actually collected about AFAM programs across the country. So that's my task for today. When I saw the program and saw I was on the panel for foundations, I thought, well, kind of black studies started back in 1915 with Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. That can't be what they want either me to talk about or they think I'm going to represent, because I'm surely not that old. Then I thought, well, the foundations of black studies at Columbia really start in the 1960s, when the Student Afro Society and the Barnard Organization of the SAS was the first one, the Barnard Organization of Soul Sisters, or BOSS, took over Hamilton Hall and went to the administration at Barnard and demanded black studies. And I thought, I'm not that old. They can't really want me to talk about that. So I'm not, although I am going to recommend Stefan Bradley's book, Harlem versus Columbia University, Black Student Power in the Late 1960s, and my colleague at Northwestern, Martha Biondi's book, The Black Revolution on Campus, both of which give that history of the early foundations of Black studies. They actually did get courses back then, and Eric Foner taught the first course that had anything to do with African American history in 1969. And some of the Black students protested that course because it was insufficient, they thought. They had a much more robust plan in mind. They wanted a Black Studies Institute that, quote, that could, quote, grant credit and set up degree programs to hire faculty and staff, to create auxiliary structures necessary for the implementation of relevant curricula on the Black experience, and to establish facilities to coordinate all recruiting of Black students and faculty. So they wanted this structure to be autonomous. They wanted it to be Black student run. As you can imagine, that was quite controversial, and part of the reason why it never really got off the ground, of course, the university balked, and the students didn't want anything half-assed, so nothing really came to fruition. So over the course of the years, there was some programming and a few courses that, a number of courses increased over the course of the years through the 1970s and 1980s, and then in 1987, and this was fun. I did part of my walk down memory lane was looking through some of the archives of the Columbia Spectator. In 1987, in the spring of 1987, the headline in the Columbia Spectator was "Racial Tensions Explode Following Weekend Brawl." And this was when two African-American students, Michael Jones and Winston Willis, were jumped on outside of Ferris Booth Hall. Ferris Booth Hall. That was also walking down memory lane for me. Ferris Booth Hall, and by a group of white students. And there was a lot of controversy on campus. The Black students got lawyers to defend, to prosecute perhaps the white students. The white students had some disciplinary action, but not enough for the mind of the Black students. And I also want to point out that Winston Willis, who was one of the students who was jumped on, is now chair of African American Studies at Metropolitan State University in Denver, is an historian and has gone on to do wonderful work in Black history. And the theme actually, unfortunately, but actually, is that struggle has begotten a number of contemporary Black scholars, as it always has. So I'll be mentioning a number of names in Black Studies today and their participation here at Columbia at that time. So that was Racial Tensions Explode Following Weekend Brawl. That was March of 1987. And by April of 1987, Afro-American major receives the Committee on Instruction go-ahead. So part of the response to those Black student unrest, which was in response to the Black students being jumped on, was the granting of an Afro-American major in the spring of 1987. Again, Winston Willis was very much involved in that. Professor Hollis Lynch from the history department was involved in that committee. And the major began in 1987. That was spring of 1987. I showed up in fall of 1987, and you couldn't have told me that we had an African American Studies major in 1987 when I read this, and I was like, really, we had an African American Studies major? Because it was kind of, you're also going, yeah, really? It was kind of a name only. And indeed, when I showed up in the fall of 1987, the headline was, "Spring Racial Furor Makes Its Mark on Class of 1991. And indeed, I'm quoted here. This is so funny. I always tell my graduate students who are doing ethnography and who are doing interviews, you have to do the transcripts yourself, you have to listen to it and code it yourself, because you're not going to remember half of that stuff that you did in those interviews. It's amazing how much we can't keep in our heads. But I was quoted as a first-year student coming into Columbia, asked how last spring's racial furor was affecting me as a first-year student. So we were already being radicalized right there in September of our freshman year, which prompted me to go on by my junior year to write an op-ed defending our invitation of Professor Griff, who was a member of Public Enemy and who had said a number of anti-Semitic things, and I wrote the op-ed for the Black Student Organization. This is hilarious. for that. But back to Black Studies, back in the spring of 1990, our Day of Rage was the collection of a number of student organizations who protested, and we had 5 demands. One, that the university not not tear down the Audubon Ballroom, and I was very involved in that, and we won, I would say, meaning I just drove up there the other day. There is the Audubon's facade, but there's a Chase Bank in the lobby, which struck me, but there's also a small museum in there as well. So one, no tearing down the Audubon. 2, divesting from South Africa. These were the core protests that happened definitely before I came and continued to happen until then. Soon, of course, Mandela was released, and soon South Africa began its reconciliation. 3 was the establishment of the Black Studies Institute, or a more robust Black Studies program. Obviously, even though there had been a major by 1987, in 1990 we were still calling for a more robust department. 4, the establishment of the Intercultural Resource Center, and one of the key student activists in that regard was Alicia Schmidt Camacho, who is now a professor at Yale in ethnic, right, you have some fans, she has some fans back there, in ethnic and racial studies and American studies, so another illustration of how this struggle really motivated a number of us to move into the intellectual pursuits that we've gone into. And 5th was calling for a gay and lesbian student center. So back in 1990, and I think kind of drawing on this idea of both diaspora and, of course, the bridges that Black Studies have made to other ethnic studies programs, to LGBT studies programs, that's exactly what we were doing at Columbia in 1990. Then soon, right before we were graduating, we thought that Columbia was going to hire Thomas Holt, the historian from the University of Chicago, and this was before Manning Marable was on the list of possibilities. And at that time, Nikki Edgecombe was quoted as saying, that Black Studies is not taken seriously enough. Until there is someone who is willing to take the program over, nothing is going to happen. No one here is ready or willing to take over the responsibility. Professor Blount, you were on leave for that year. This is funny, you can read all of these too. You're all quoted in all of these. You were on leave that year. I remember Professor Blount being, perhaps not the only, one of the very few Black faces for us to take classes from. That's where I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, which I've gone on to read about 12 times. It's my favorite book. So thank you for that introduction and for being really a leader in this struggle alongside students. And I mentioned Nikki Edgecombe's name because she's gone on to get her PhD, and she is now a researcher at Teachers College here at Columbia. So again, all of that kind of history was the motivation for many of us to go in the direction that we've gone. So as we all know how the story ends, ultimately Manning Marable is hired, and that really is why we're celebrating now 20 years of IRAAS. So I'm happy to say that ultimately something came into fruition. I'm happy and pleased to see how robust and active and vibrant IRAAS is after all these years. And that doesn't mean for the students here that your work is done and that your protests are over. As we heard last night from Professor Smith, there's always more resources needed. There's always new directions to be forged. Okay, I'm going to move into a little bit of the kind of research I do, which also is framed by this 1987 moment, because in 1987 was the year that William Julius Wilson's book, The Truly Disadvantaged, was published. I read it here at Columbia in Lynn Chancer's class, and it really motivated me not to study the population that William Julius Wilson studied, which was the African-American urban poor, but instead to study the Black middle class. Because when Wilson published The Truly Disadvantaged, a whole industry grew up to study urban poverty and Black urban poverty, and I felt it very much obscured the broad diversity of the Black community, and there really wasn't much after that time on that diversity. So my research focuses on the folks right in the middle of the Black community. and indeed, literally for me, in the middle of the U.S. black community, because I went on to study Chicago, so in the middle of the country as well. To be clear, when I say I study the black middle class, I don't study people like myself. I have a PhD and earn a very comfortable salary, but only 7.5% of blacks hold any graduate degree, and only 0.9% of blacks have a doctorate. Also, only 3% of blacks earn over $100,000. So I'm not the black middle class, and many folks in here aren't either. The black middle class, the core of the black middle class consists of teachers and social workers and bus drivers and civil servants and administrative assistants, insurance reps, call center managers, medical assistants, and on and on and on. I subtitle my book Black Picket Fences, which was my study of the black middle class, as this group being characterized by simultaneous privilege and peril. Another word I frequently use is fragility. The cover art for Black Picket Fences was, what we used was a painting by Kerry James Marshall, a very well-known African-American artist, and the painting that we used is called Bang, and in that painting he suggests this fragility, this simultaneous having arrived but not quite arrived, by showing 3 little kids pledging allegiance to the flag in a neighborhood with a white picket fence, but next to a Weber grill that is billowing this ominous smoke, and a garden hose that looks like it's about to encircle the little girl and perhaps even yank her off of her feet. So there are these mixed messages of having arrived, but either where is it that we've arrived, or have we really arrived? So in Black Picket Fences, I did an ethnography of a black middle class neighborhood in Chicago that I call Groveland. Groveland was the destination of what those who participated in what William Julius Wilson called the exodus of middle and working class blacks from increasingly poor neighborhoods in cities. But the truly disadvantaged also generated a whole bunch of demography, and that demography showed that on any number of indicators, middle-class blacks lived in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than did middle-class whites. So by the percentage of people with a college degree, or the presence of vacant buildings, crime, school quality, middle-class blacks lived in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, and oftentimes in more disadvantaged neighborhoods even than poor whites. For middle-class families living in Groveland, this translated into perilous terrain for raising young people. And it also meant fewer resources than those enjoyed by middle-class whites. So for example, Sheila Boone stated sarcastically, quote, "Well, there's nothing past the University of Chicago, don't you know that?" What she was referring to was the neglect of the predominantly African-American South Side, which is located, at least from the perspective of those business people downtown, past the University of Chicago. Recently, I updated Black Picket Fences, and I went back to the neighborhood and re-interviewed people I had talked to in the 1990s. And I'll just mention a few points about the socioeconomic fragility that I talk about in Black Picket Fences and in much of my work. For example, Cynthia Keys responded to my question about if she thought she had outpaced her parents in terms of her own career development. She said the following, quote, "It's funny you bring that up. I was going through some old paperwork, and I found out when my mom filled out my financial aid paper my freshman year in college. And I saw how much money she made, and I cried. I picked up the phone and called her, and I said, 'And you put me through college with that salary?' To know that she was making that much having 2 kids in college, and I'm considerably above where she was around the same age." So this was Cynthia's American dream moment, when she realized she was doing better than her parents. She wasn't rich and her parents weren't poor, so it wasn't a rags to riches story, but nonetheless she had experienced this core American belief of upward mobility. But when we look nationally at mobility stories, we realize that upward mobility is not obviously the only trajectory, and indeed downward mobility is just as, if not more common for African American families. So for example, the Pew Charitable Trust has some recent research that shows that for African Americans and whites who grew up in middle class families, more than half of African Americans end up in a lower rung of the income distribution compared to only 1/3 of whites. So more than half of middle-class African Americans end up in a lower rung of the income distribution. And as you can imagine, then upward mobility is less common among blacks than among whites. 26% of middle-income blacks end up in a higher rung on the class ladder than their parents, compared to 44% of middle-class whites. Black Picket Fences contains many stories that give life to these numbers. The peril of the book's subtitle captures the ever-present specter of downward mobility. One example was the four-generation Graham family. While James Graham, the family's patriarch, earned enough to buy his house in Groveland in the 1960s and ensure that his wife never had to work, neither his daughter nor his granddaughter achieved similar financial independence as adults. The most unfortunate cases of downward mobility were the young people who were killed or jailed because of their forays into the world with drugs and gangs. "Oh, you so lucky," Lucille Arthur recalled her friends telling her about her daughter, who she actually thought was somewhat of a failure because she hadn't settled into a career after college and just had a couple of jobs. But her friends said, "You don't know. Your child ain't on drugs. Your child ain't calling you every week for money. She's supporting herself." So this positive spin only illustrated the possible depths of some falls down the class ladder. So given that I'm kind of running out of time, I'm going to not go too much more into some of the other things that I was going to talk about my own research, because you can read the book. No, I'm not really, but because I do want to get back to Black Studies and to commemorate and recognize and celebrate all the work that has been done here at Columbia and across the country. In 2012 at Northwestern, we had a conference convening all of the PhD programs in Black Studies across the country. And at that time, that included Temple, Yale, UMass Amherst, Berkeley, Harvard, Michigan State, Northwestern, UW-Milwaukee, Penn, Indiana, Brown, and now we can add UT Austin. So those are the PhD granting universities. And we did a survey. We sent out surveys to all of those PhD granting universities to get a sense of what was going on in their programs, how many students they were how many students they were getting applications from, what their graduates were doing, and so on and so forth. And a couple of things that I find really interesting, and I think it relates to what Josh was saying earlier, is the range of names that our programs are called. So we have a number that are called African American Studies. Temple, Yale, UMass Amherst is Afro-American Studies, Berkeley. But we also see this kind of schizophrenia on what we should call ourselves. There's some that have other names. Penn is Africana Studies. UT Austin, the newest, is African and African Diaspora Studies. But even for those who have settled on a name, as is the case with Michigan State, their materials just use all kind of terms. So Michigan State says, African American and African Studies is a cross-college, university-wide PhD, MA granting interdisciplinary program. Then as they go on, they call themselves in the study of the African diaspora. Then they go on to say, in the Black Studies discipline. Then they go on to say, the Africana experience. So in their little statement of themselves, they have all of these terms: Africana, African American, African diaspora, Black Studies. And I think you see this kind of all of us going back and forth on our language because of our desire to be inclusive and to recognize and not exclude both populations, experiences, histories, cultures of all of those groups. It's also clear when we scanned all of the web pages of these PhD granting universities that many of them, at least 6 of the 11, explicitly named social responsibility, outreach, or social justice goals. This included UMass Amherst, which said, quote, service and outreach goals to provide leadership and service to organizations as well as communities and agencies at the municipal, state, federal, and global levels. Berkeley's program, quote, is engaged in significant efforts at community outreach with its Poetry for the People program. And of course, IRAAS falls right in line with that, being founded on both scholarship and service. One place where we have some work to do is in our own programs, hiring our own graduates. I don't necessarily mean that we need to, circle around all of, that my Northwestern PhD should come to Columbia, although if you have a job, I have a few on the market. We don't all have to get passed around that way, but 6 of the programs reported having 1 or more current faculty members with a PhD in Black Studies or Ethnic Studies, but that's only 6 of the 11. So we need to get at least where all of our programs are hiring PhDs in Black Studies. And then finally, what I find most encouraging is, for example, at Northwestern, the 5-year trend in applications to our PhD program showed an increase of 152% over the first 5 years of our applicant pool. In 2012, we had 88 applications and made 8 offers of admissions for a selectivity rate of 9%, which at Northwestern was better than all of our humanities programs and better than the average selectivity in the social sciences programs at Northwestern. In 2013, we had 96 applicants and made 5 offers. All 5 of our offers came. So that kind of both what we call selectivity and yield, I think, is really boding well for PhD programs in Black Studies. So that's, I think, where I'll stop there in a kind of cheerleading mode for the work that we do. And once again, to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I look forward to a stimulating afternoon.
All right, I think we do have a few minutes for some questions and comments, if we might do so. I'd like to maybe spend just a couple of minutes talking about, and I'm sorry, can everyone hear me? Yeah, all right. Thank you so much to our panelists, by the way, for wonderful and stimulating papers about the foundations of Black Studies, and also some comments about our possible futures as well. So some of you also encroached on the territory of the coming panel, but I'm sure they won't mind at all. Some of our themes that we've had here talked about engagement, and where is our mission regarding how we think about our immediate environment in terms of, as Mary just spoke, that so many of our programs explicitly mention social engagement or social responsibility, social justice, and of course that's part of the founding mission of IRAAS here and many other programs. But then also, as Josh pointed out, that how do we engage our environment, just not in the most literal sense, even though the local is part of Josh's explication of urban citizenship and diaspora, but also how do we think of ourselves within a larger world and a diasporic world as well. I think that also both of those aspects speak a lot to the foundation. There are many foundations to Black Studies, and it's great that we've titled this panel in the plural and not the singular, because there, as Mary pointed out at the beginning of her comments, that there are many kind of foundational moments, right? Kind of the enterprise and the discipline refounds itself. That's just, can we strike that from the tape? Reestablishes itself recurrently from generation to generation. So I think that's something to think about as well. And that, how do we, what are some of the foundational moments for us? Josh said that in his work, he tries to think, or at least eschew the assumption that Black Studies is always at the moment of conflict, and that there are other things going on when we think about, particularly as he said in his case, urban citizenship and the diasporic enterprise, or at least the scholarly enterprise of diaspora. For Jonathan Rieder, much of it, for him, the enterprise is what he called an ethnography of the individual, which I'd be curious to hear some comment about how that might distinguish itself from, for example, the enterprise of biography. Last week, if those of you who weren't here, we might have tape from a lecture from Barbara Ransby, who was here a week ago today, who spoke about what it means. She's a 2-time biographer now, 2 of the most fascinating people in Black history, and 2 most complex people. And she has spoken widely about what is biography as a mode of writing history. So there's that as well. And then there's also thinking about the historical moments. Do we think of Black Studies as being founded not, as Josh said, necessarily in a moment of conflict, but then also in a moment of historical memory. I think for Rieder's work, faith and communal memory is part of the enterprise as well. And then for Mary's work, it's there was quite a few rich things, and you probably saw me scribbling frantically all over the place, and I'm trying to keep track of my notes here. But there's the moment of Black Studies birth and rebirth at various campuses in the 1960s, and then also the mission, particularly for those of us who work at the intersections of qualitative and quantitative, as Mary does, how we think about class formations and the variety of existences in the Black world. I want to see a copy of that survey, by the way, as well, because I think it's fascinating that we're also at a point now that we need to, kind of do the self-studies, which we've been doing for years and years now, but I think we're at a very interesting point with the acceleration of doctoral programs in the discipline. I'm sure I've looked at a lot of themes that came out in this panel, and I'm sure that some of the members of our audience might want to maybe perhaps pose a question as well. I think we have Dr. Hart here.
Josh, thank you for the comment about the Caribbean Americans, African Americans, and the distinction that you make. I just wonder if you can speak a little more about that. Having grown up in a sort of Bahamian community in Miami, where parents and grandparents had come over from the Bahamas, whereas the children, they all essentially just became African Americans in terms of how the society saw them and how they saw themselves. So maybe you can speak a little more about that.
I think you described it. I mean, I'm not sure actually I can add a lot. I mean, there are actually some great work in anthropology. The Onícola Bennett, for example, who's worked on second-generation Caribbean American girls, and sort of the sort of production of girlhood and youth culture amongst that population, and she focuses on Brooklyn. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, you might say, ambivalence of those second-generation folks towards Black American culture. I mean, there's a great attraction as Black American culture has pushed itself to the center of youth culture in America. I mean, there's some great attraction there, but I think there's also ambivalence that maybe is generated by that second generation itself, but also from the first generation, from the immigrant generation, who associate certain negative characteristics with Black American culture around education or other kinds of behaviors, true or not true, or empirical or not. There are those ideas that circulate in Caribbean American communities. So I think both things happen at once, and it's sort of beyond the purview of my own research, but I just want to sort of gesture towards that dynamic and say that we can sort of think in more complicated ways about that. Thanks for the question.
Yes, and if you don't mind, since we're also recording this, would you also state your name and where you're from when you ask your question, please?
Janelle Drone is my name, and I'm an alumni from Teachers College and School of International Education. And I was here during the same time, and a lot of what you were saying about the conflict, the controversy, and African American, Afrocentric. I mean, there were so many different names applied to the structure of where it was going. But in New York City and in New York State, they were kind of like called Black Studies. And right up at City College, there was a lot of conflict with the director. I think everyone would know, I'm speaking of Leonard Jeffries, and it was a very vibrant program, but eventually, somehow that program got destroyed. That's my term, but it didn't no longer exist. From a very vibrant program, I guess where I'm going is, what do you think were the root causes of such vibrant programs? And in New York State, in Albany, Toni Morrison was there at one time, and they had some very powerful people, but those programs no longer exist under that structure. Can any one of you talk about what happened? And that was in the early 80s. I mean, give the numbers and you tell your age. But it was a very strong, tight-knit, I thought, scholarly and service approach to being educated in the history of our people. But
So I don't know the specifics of the programs you're referring to, so I'll take this opportunity just to make some more broad statements about the need, first, to always be vigilant about resources. And I can say this from Northwestern. When I got to Northwestern in 1998, the program, the Black Studies program, the African American Studies program was floundering. They were, maybe, I think there were 3 tenured professors, and that was it. Leon Forrest, who had headed the program for many years, had passed away recently, and it was just, very, very weak. The point there is when programs get small like that, there's very little energy to maintain the kind of programming and activism and majors and minors and courses and so on. So to be vigilant to guard and hoard our resources, I think, is key. Many of our programs are flourishing now, but as you're saying, there were others that were flourishing at one point and then dwindled. So I think we need to be ever vigilant to the point of, perhaps even sounding paranoid, you can't take this line away from me, those kinds of things, to maintain the capacity to do the programming and the teaching and the curricular stuff that we do. And then second, key to that, but I think the resources are first, and second to that is then the leadership. Leadership alone can't do it, because if there's just one person and that one person can't teach all the classes, you're still not going to have undergrads to major in and so on and so forth. But the leadership has to creates that kind of continuity, continues to make those demands, is the person there to protect those resources. And again, not knowing the specifics of what you're referring to, my guess is, if there are leadership conflicts with the university, there need to be leadership conflicts, obviously, but strong leadership, committed leadership, continuous leadership with the right kinds of resources, I think, is what stems those kinds of ebbs and flows that you're talking about, to make sure that our programs that are flourishing don't at one time, 20 years down the road, end up being languishing.
I think I lost track there. I think there was, yes, ma'am, yes.
I'm Dr. Falu, and I'm teaching a course I created called Afro-Latino History and Culture at City College, Black Stories. So my question in terms of Mari Pattilo to amplify that same point, that even though we're recognizing PhD programs are growing, in reality there have been an attack to diminish Black studies, and in some cases to make it disappear at many levels, and witness what's happening at Cornell, what's happening at City College, with different programs. And I concur with those two priorities that she established in terms of resources and in terms of leadership. And I would even emphasize more the resources, the endowed chairs that will be untouchable, because that would be the only way that faculty lines could not disappear from colleges once the donation has been restricted. So that's the first point. The second point that I want to do is in terms of acknowledging the diaspora. We have talked of African Americans and we have talked of West Indies, but even lately with Africa reapproachment to the diaspora, I've been participating in the May 2012 South Africa event, World Forum, where Africa invited an incredible number, huge number of Afro-Latino from South and Central America. And my own study revealed that there are over 4 million African descendants who speak Spanish, and therefore we have coined that Afro-Latino term, which probably will be evolving just like Black and Negro and all of that develop. But the point is that the concept of the diaspora has been widening, and we have to acknowledge those different groups that are making a contribution, and the unity that is needed for all of us to vis-a-vis the relationship with Africa strengthen those studies. For example, I remember I tried to send a student here to Columbia, and we were looking for a program with credit, conducive to a degree. You could correct me, I would welcome that. We didn't find any program conducive to a degree in African studies here at Columbia University. And if you go, many times institutes are established or different programs just to give the facade that something exists. But when you look at research, there's no program with credit comparable to other degrees in many other fields.
You have the MA.
Did you say African Studies or African American
Well,
Studies,
well,
degree granting program?
Africa-focused programs, degree granting.
Oh, African Studies.
It
Oh,
could be African, or it could be African American, or it could be Africana, or a different name.
we've had a master, in African American Studies, we've had a master's degree for quite some time in a very robust program as well. Now, if you were thinking of African Studies, I
But
can't
at the
speak.
level of undergraduate, do you have anything?
I mean, we've had a major and a concentration for quite a bit of time, and again, both very robust.
Well, since
With the
1987, although not
Right,
robust
so-
till.
okay,
till-
all right.
till ours. But no, but that's a
Recent
long time,
memory has been
20
quite
years is,
robust.
I'm celebrating.
I've been here for a decade. It's been robust since the day I arrived. I don't know about 87.
May I respond to that last point just to give you some information? They do have an African studies major now for PhD, master, and undergraduate in MISAS. The Middle Eastern, South Asian Studies, and African Studies. It's a department where you get an African Studies, master's, undergraduate, and PhD.
Thank you so much for clarifying. And that's a recent change as
That's a
well.
recent
That's
change.
the last 2
Very
years or so.
recent.
Great, thank you. That's Abdul Nanji, who's affiliated with that program and also a longtime friend of ours as well. So.
I have a question. Please. Recently, by the way, my name is Abdul Nanji for the recording, and I teach at IRAAS and teach Swahili language, history, research, and culture. The question is about this diaspora notion. I was confronted, but a discussion with the younger generation that are here. And by the way, the question that you had raised about Bahamas and the notion of Bahamian community, there's a difference a little bit that I would shift depending on who are you marrying. Are you marrying another Bahamian and then you have them, or are you marrying outside the Bahamian community? Are you marrying an African American, somebody from Georgia, or are you marrying a Puerto Rican woman from the? So we have those other dimensions that come into the play. So now the quote-unquote identity factor of what you may have is you have a child who's born from an African American woman from here, and you're from Bahamian, or Bahamas, let's say. Then what would be the child's notion of the African American perception of that culture? And vis-a-vis, as you were mentioning earlier, in terms of perception of African Americans by the West Indian community, there's a problem here in terms of the sensitivity of culture and so on. So there are those dimensions. But let me come back to my point that I really wanted to raise. That was a discussion with the younger generation. They said that, no, we are rejecting the notion of diaspora. They said, no, you can't put me in a diaspora. Diaspora is only a geographical location. But I want my being. My being is not discussed. I am an African by birth, connection, heritage. So why are you putting me outside that notion? Why are you putting me in the diaspora? Why am I not part and parcel of this whole notion of Africanity? So they are rejecting the notion of diaspora. They say, no, let's reject it, because if you put me in the diaspora, then I'm out. I'm not part of this, of the whole heritage that I have. So there's going to be a discussion on how do we deal with the question of diaspora. Do we call ourselves in the diaspora now? People are saying, no, I'm not diaspora now. I came in from my ancestors.
We're actually over time, but I think I'll give one or more of our panelists. Josh, this might be. Sorry. All right, which one do we go? Okay, all right. And yeah, I'm sorry, sir, you have had your hand up for a while. So why don't you pose your question? Maybe we can do both at once. Yeah.
No, you raised some excellent points.
No, actually, do you mind? Yeah, we'll get one last question, and then we'll answer both at the same time.
Van Tran from Columbia Sociology. Thank you so much for all three presentations. I have two comments, actually, not questions, but I'll try to make it brief and quick. The first is really about the importance of placing the studies of African American experience in the larger context of the more diverse and multi-ethnic American society going forward. I mean, when I listened to Jonathan's comments this morning, it was very much framed in the black-white framework of the 1960s. And we know that the future of American society, but also the future of inequality, if you will, is multi-ethnic and multi-racial. And I think we have to begin looking beyond just the African American community with its multitude of diversity that Josh pointed to, to make connections to Asian American studies, Latino studies, and the different ethnic and racial groups that are part of our society. The second comment has to do with Mary's point about engagement with the community and with the city that we're part of. And I wanted to really encourage all of us to basically try to engage with New York City and the various communities within New York City in our research, in our scholarship, and in our service as well, because I think that is such a wonderful opportunity for us to carry out a type of work that we could do here, not just in Harlem, but beyond the boroughs of Manhattan. Thank you.
Just to speak a little bit on diaspora, and maybe to also open the open some space for Professor Jafari Allen later this afternoon, who's maybe pick up some of these questions as well. I'm gonna push it off on you. No, but I think we ought not to generalize, first of all, about about generations, about groups, any of these groups. But I think there's a way in which we can think about diaspora as a resource, right? And we actually point to groups who use diaspora in that way. I mean, so traditional notions of diaspora, whether they're talking about the Jewish diaspora or Armenian diaspora or what have you, are rooted in questions of exile, expulsion, so on and so forth. I think, and of course the African experience has that dimension as well at its core. But I think where we are in the late 20th and early 21st century, diaspora has taken on different kinds of connotations within the Black world. I write about this sort of second generation of Black Brits or Afro-Caribbeans who are born in Britain to Caribbean immigrant parents. And in the 1970s, they are, in some ways, as you described, making claims to British citizenship. They said that we're not from Jamaica, we're not from Barbados, we were born here, and it informs their politics. At the same time, though, they're also engaged in solidarity struggles around South Africa, around anti-apartheid. They're looking to the kind of music and culture of Jamaica. They're looking to the music and culture of Afro-America as resources, as they're mounting these kind of local struggles, which to me sort of suggests the local, the national, the transnational all at once. But I think part of what your comment and your question raised, again, is this notion of diaspora maybe as a set of resources, and for us to try to identify what those resources are, when they are pertinent or salient to people and when they are not. And then finally, we have, as many commenters have raised, this question of power and resource asymmetries. Whether we're talking at the institutional level between the city colleges and the Columbias, or between Afro-Colombian communities, say, and U.S. African American communities, there are these resource asymmetries, and we need to start theorizing and thinking about how we can both identify and address those kinds of inequalities within the Black world and within Black studies.
John, can you say something about the issue that was raised in terms of the framing? One of the things that people talk about is us broadening the sort of focus as opposed to this white-black sort of frame. But when I think about the prisons, when I think about unemployment, and I think about all those sorts of things, the people who are still paying the price disproportionately are Black folks. Can you say something about that issue that was raised?
I'm sorry, you want me to comment on it?
Well, I mean,
oh, no, I didn't hear whether you said John.
Yeah, please.
Well, I would pick up on Bentran's point, and I think Josh's earlier point, going back in history about sort of the complicated entanglements, often bonds as well as conflict between West Indians or Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans. As an ethnographic matter, you have an incredible experiment going out there, which we've been locked in this black-white kind of framing, which has been spilling over the bounds, not just with West Indians, but with Asians. And so I think we need a lot more studies of the kind of diversity of connections that are being forged among all these different groups out in America. Anybody who knows anything about the high schools or any communities knows the local variation is huge. And sort of a lot of the work on West Indians, which emphasizes West Indian distancing from African Americans. Well, even when you read the surveys and interview questions, it's clear that that distancing can mean 5 different things and often coexist with tremendous empathy for the slavery experience. So I'm going to expand that now. I don't think that in race and ethnicity, as it used to be called, we've done enough of thinking about the complicated entanglements with class. Mm-hmm. And I think in that sense, bringing lower class whites into the discussion as well helps broaden our understanding about the way these things are playing out, because we have in this country a tendency to substitute race and ethnic framing for what are often class dimensions, even if historically they've been produced by racial forces. So I just think we need much more subtlety in thinking about the class dimensions that often underlie, for example, a lot of West Indian and African American conflict.
I might also want to add to that, that as a historian, I've often noted that the way in which we remember that framing is often a product of political moments since then. And there was a lot of this is the product of the Cold War, that we've remembered that particularly the 1950s and the 60s as being that black-white political framing, when in fact, as Josh pointed out at the top of his talk, the Black Studies enterprise, and I might add to that quite a bit of black politics itself, has had an international framing as well, and that goes back to kind of classical 19th century black nationalism through Garvey, but then also through the 30s internationalism, and this is Mika Makalani's new book, I think it was a couple years ago, that still counts as new. Frank Doritty's done work on the early 20th century in this, and then Gerald Horne put out a book recently talking about the United Nations and the Black American struggle and black internationalism, and there's much more about that. So a lot of that is recent scholarship. We kind of were raised in a moment to think that black history was just black versus white, because so much of it was tied with it. Otherwise, would have been tied with internationalism, and then would have brought us out of the American liberal paradigm to thinking about other political possibilities, if I make sense. So King, for example, was deeply interested, as were everybody else, with the Bandung Conference and the emergence of non-aligned nations. But that doesn't, every February, that's not part of, Black History Month. It's kind of just I Have a Dream, and it's Selma, it's Birmingham, etc. So that's the moderator. I took a certain privilege on that. I think we probably should go because we're now well officially over time. But thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you all again at 2 p.m. for the panel on futures. Thank you. Thank you.